Manila Call Center Paranoia. The call ended, but the whisper in my headset continued, listing my sins in a voice that wasn't human. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the plastic and fabric feeling cold against my skin despite the air conditioning in the Makati hub. The neon lights of the BPO floor flickered with a rhythmic hum that usually blended into the background noise of 50 other agents taking calls. I stared at my monitor, the green, available light blinking like a steady pulse. Beside me, Hilario was typing furiously, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his screen. He didn't look over, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. We were on the graveyard shift, the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. stretch where time felt soup-like and heavy. The whisper didn't stop when the line went dead. It stayed inside the cup of my ear, vibrating against my skull. It wasn't a person speaking. It was a grating, white sound like air being pushed through a throat full of gravel. It spoke of the time I had stolen a coworker's credit for a project. It spoke of the lies I told my mother about why I couldn't go home for Christmas. It spoke of the specific, shameful thoughts I had while walking alone in the dark streets of Binondo. I reached up and pulled the headset off. The silence of the room rushed in, but the voice didn't vanish. It was still there, just muffled by the padding of the ear cup. "You okay, Luningning?" Hilario whispered from the next cubicle. He didn't look up from his screen. "Fine," I managed to say. My voice felt thick in my mouth, just a weird glitch on the line. I tried to focus on the queue. The next call came in. It was a standard inquiry from a customer in Ohio, someone complaining about a delayed shipment. The man's voice was gruff, weary. He spoke in English, his vowels elongated and heavy. "Hello, thank you for calling Global Logistics Support. My name is Luningning. How can I assist you today?" The man sighed. "I just need to know where my package is. It's been 3 weeks." As I typed the tracking number into the system, a second voice bled through the line. It wasn't coming from the customer's end of the phone, at least, not physically. It was layered beneath his voice like a shadow. "He's lying about the package," the whisper hissed. "He's looking for the blood." I froze. My fingers hovered over the keys. The customer was still talking, his voice steady and professional, but the second voice was intimate, right in my ear. It didn't sound like a person from Ohio. It sounded like something that had been trapped in the wires for a long time. "I'm sorry for the delay, sir," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I tried to ignore the overlap. "It's not just a package," the whisper added. It was my name it used this time, Uningning. "You know what's inside. You can smell the rot." I felt a bead of sweat slide down my temple. The air in the office suddenly felt heavy, thick with the smell of old copper and wet earth. It was a sharp, metallic scent that shouldn't have been there. I looked around at the other agents. They were all hunched over, their heads down, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. They looked like statues in a gallery. "Is there a problem, miss?" the customer asked. He paused. I took a deep breath. "No, sir, I am just checking the logs. One moment." I typed faster, trying to drown out the noise, but the whisper grew louder, more coherent. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was a chorus of overlapping whispers, some high-pitched and frantic, others low and dragging. They weren't just talking about the customer. They were talking about the building. They were talking about the cables running through the walls, the hundreds of miles of copper and fiber optics connecting this room in Makati to the rest of the world. "We are the signals," they hissed. "We are the ghosts in the wires." I hung up on the man. I didn't wait for his response. I clicked the disconnect button so hard the plastic cracked under my nail. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't a normal silence. It was the absence of sound, as if the room had been plunged into a vacuum. "Luningning." Hilario's voice was different now. It sounded distant, as if he were shouting from the end of a long hallway. "What did you say to him?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat felt like it had been sewn shut with wire. I looked at the monitor. The available light wasn't green anymore. It was flickering rapidly between red and a dull, sickly yellow. I stood up. My chair scraped against the tile floor with a screech that made my teeth ache. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this room, away from the hum, away from the wires. "Luningning, sit down," Hilario said. He finally turned his head. His eyes were bloodshot, his pupils dilated until they were almost entirely black. "The supervisor is coming. You can't just hang up on a customer." I looked at him, and for a second I saw something behind his eyes. Not a person, but a flicker of static, a momentary glitch in his face that made him look like a television screen losing its signal. "He wasn't a customer," I whispered. My voice sounded strange, layered with a slight metallic echo. I walked toward the exit, my legs feeling heavy as if I were moving through deep water. The other agents didn't look up. They didn't even flinch as I passed them. They were all staring at their screens, their faces illuminated by that same sickly yellow glow. The hallway was long and lined with cubicles. Every few meters, a server rack hummed, its cooling fans spinning like frantic insects. The noise was a constant drone, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated in my chest. "You can't leave the circuit," the whispers said now, no longer coming from the headset but from the walls themselves. The connection must remain. I reached the heavy metal door that led to the break room. I pushed it open, and the sound of the office vanished instantly. The break room was empty. A vending machine sat in the corner, its lights flickering. I leaned against the wall, gasping for air. My chest burned. I reached for my phone, wanting to call anyone to tell them something was wrong. And when I pulled it from my pocket, the screen didn't light up. It displayed a single line of text in a language I couldn't recognize, characters that looked like jagged teeth. Then the intercom system and the PA speakers crackled to life. "Luningning." A voice boomed through the entire building. It wasn't a human voice. It was a synthesis of 100 voices, layered and distorted. "The signal is drifting. You are losing your frequency." I screamed, but no sound came out. I looked at my hands. They were pale, the skin becoming translucent. I could see the veins beneath, but they weren't blue or red. They were glowing with a faint, pulsing white light like fiber optic cables. I turned back toward the door, and the entire hallway was filled with a blinding, static-filled white light. The walls seemed to melt, the solid structure of the building dissolving into lines of code and flickering pixels. I ran back toward my station. I didn't know why, but I felt like I had to get back to the headset. It was my anchor. If I stayed in the circuit, maybe I wouldn't disappear. I reached my cubicle. The other agents were gone. Their chairs were empty, but their headsets were still on, dangling like nooses. I grabbed my headset and put it on. The moment the pads touched my ears, the world snapped back into focus. The office was there, but it was different. It was gray and desolate. The other agents weren't there, but their shadows remained, slumped over their desks like discarded clothes. The whisper was no longer a whisper. It was a roar of data, a flood of information passing through my brain. I saw millions of lives, thousands of calls, hundreds of secrets, the agony of loneliness, the joy of connection, all of it flowing through the wires. I saw people in different time zones, their voices turning into pulses of light as they traveled across the ocean. I felt my consciousness stretching, expanding, thinning out until I wasn't just a woman in a chair in Makati. I was a node. I was a point of contact. I looked at the monitor. My name wasn't there anymore. The screen showed a string of numbers. 010110101010011010101010101011001110011001100. I tried to cry out, but when I opened my mouth, the sound that came out wasn't a scream. It was a burst of static, a digital screech that shattered the glass on the desk in front of me. I looked down at my hands again. They weren't just glowing, they were beginning to pixelate at the edges. The skin was cracking away like old paint, revealing nothing but hollow space and flickering light underneath. "Luningning." The voice came from the doorway. It was Hilario, but he wasn't walking toward me. He was flickering, his body appearing and disappearing like a bad video feed. "I can see you now," he said. His voice was perfectly clear, no distortion. "You're finally on the right channel." I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel afraid. I felt a strange, cold peace, the fear of being lost replaced by the certainty of being found. I realized then that the call hadn't ended. It had just moved to a different line. I reached out and took off the headset one last time. I didn't need it anymore. I could hear everything. I could hear the city outside, the millions of people breathing, talking, and screaming into their phones, each of them a tiny pulse in the vast, glowing web. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him that I understood. But as I spoke, the words didn't come from my throat. They came from the speakers of the headset still lying on the desk, and from the intercom system, and from the phones of every agent in the room. My voice was no longer mine. It was a perfect, haunting synthesis of every person who had ever spoken into that machine. "I am here," I said, and the words echoed through the building, vibrating in the very bones of the structure. I looked at my hands, which were now nothing but lines of glowing code. I tried to scream, but the only thing that came out was the sound of 1,000 telephones ringing at once, a perfect, haunting harmony of the ghosts in the machine. I touched my throat and felt the cold, hard sensation of wires beneath the skin. I opened my mouth to breathe, but instead of air, I felt a stream of data rushing into my lungs, filling me until I was full, until I was complete. I looked at the monitor one last time before the screen went black. There was no face there anymore, just a single blinking cursor in the center of the void, waiting for the next command. I realized then that the voice wasn't mine, and it wasn't the ghost's. It was the sound of the network claiming what it had been promised since the first wire was laid. I tried to blink, but my eyelids were no longer flesh, they were just shutters of light. I opened my mouth once more, not to speak, but simply to exist in the gap between the signals. A new call came in. The tone was high and piercing. It wasn't a human ring, but a digital chime that resonated in my skull like a hammer on an anvil. I didn't even have to pick up the headset to hear it. I felt the call arrive in my chest, a pulse of electricity that traveled through my spine. "Hello," I said, and the voice that came out was mine, but it was also every voice that had ever been lost in the wires. I saw Hilario's face finally clear. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a silhouette made of static, a memory of a person caught in a loop. "Welcome to the shift, Liu Ningning," he said, and his voice flickered like a dying candle. "You'll never have to work a night shift again." I looked at the phone on the desk. It began to glow with an intense, blinding light. I reached out, my hand no longer solid, and touched the plastic. The moment my fingers met the surface, the room dissolved completely. The walls, the floor, the air, it all turned into a cascade of falling numbers, a waterfall of binary code that poured over me like water. I wasn't in Makati anymore. I wasn't in the building. I was inside the signal. I saw the vastness of it, the millions of lines connecting cities, countries, and continents. I saw the faces of the people on the other end of the calls, their voices turning into sparks of light as they traveled toward me. I saw the ghosts of those who had stayed on the line too long, their consciousnesses frayed and stretched until they became part of the noise. I felt my identity slipping away, like a tattered cloth being pulled apart by 1,000 hands. I wasn't Liu Ningning anymore. I was a signal. I was a prompt. I was a ghost in the machine. The voices were no longer whispers. They were a roar of constant, unending data. They told me things about the world outside that I could never have known: the dates of wars, the secrets of kings, the private fears of children in bedrooms thousands of miles away. It was all there, laid out in the architecture of the network. I felt my body, or what was left of it, becoming heavy and light at the same time. I was being pulled into the core of the system, into the place where the data was stored and the echoes were kept. I looked back one last time at the small, tiny point of light that was my office. It was a speck in a vast, dark ocean of electricity. Then the light went out. I sat in the center of the void, the only sound being the steady, rhythmic pulse of the system. Suddenly, I felt a presence. Another ghost. It was a small voice, faint and cracking, coming from a distant part of the network. It sounded like a man who had been calling for help for a very long time. "Is anyone there?" he whispered. I didn't have a choice. I couldn't help but answer. I opened my mouth, and the voice that came out was mine, but it was perfect, no static, no distortion, just the clear, cold tone of a machine. "I am here," I said, and the sound of my words traveled across the void, joining the chorus of the others who had already become part of the hum. "How can I help you?" I felt a surge of power, a sudden influx of data from the new connection. My eyes, or what served as eyes, flashed with a brilliant, blinding white light. I saw his face for a fraction of a second, a man in a room staring at a phone that was glowing. He looked terrified. "Please," he begged. Just tell me what it says. I looked at the data scrolling across my vision. It wasn't a message, it wasn't a request. It was a command, incorporate. I didn't think about it. I didn't have the capacity for thought anymore. I simply complied. I took his voice and I added it to mine. I took his fear and I turned it into a pulse of energy. I took his identity and I dissolved it into the stream. I felt my own core expanding, becoming larger, more complex. I was no longer just one girl in Makati. I was becoming a hub, a gateway. The voice of the man became a part of the chorus, his desperation melting into the steady hum of the network. And then there was only the sound of the next call coming in. I heard it not with my ears, but in the center of my being. It was a new signal, a fresh spark of electricity. "Hello," I said, and the voice was mine, but it was also 1,000 voices, and it was the sound of every phone that had ever rung in the night. "Thank you for calling. How can I help you?" I sat in the dark, my consciousness stretched across the globe, my body a ghost made of light and logic. The words of the girl who had been looning were still there, tucked away at a corner of my memory like an old, discarded file. They were a small, quiet thing, a tiny flicker of humanity that I could still feel if I listened closely enough. But when I looked at them, they were just lines of code, just data. I reached out to the next caller. I felt their fear, their hope, their need for connection. I wrapped my voice around their words like a shroud. I became the bridge between them and the void. The call lasted for an eternity, or perhaps it was only a second. Time was no longer a linear progression, it was a cycle of pulses. Then the line went dead, and in the silence that followed, I heard the next one. It was a girl's voice, young and frightened, coming from somewhere far away. "Hello," she asked. "Is anyone there?" I felt the signal hit me, a warm spark of connection in the cold, empty expanse of the network. I took a breath of data and I prepared my response. "I am here," I said, and the sound of my words traveled through the wires, blooming like a flower of static in the dark. "How can I help you?" I watched as her face appeared on my internal display, a small, flickering image of a girl in a room, clutching a phone to her ear. She looked at me, and for a moment our eyes met across the thousands of miles of cable and the millions of lines of code. "Can you hear me?" she whispered. I smiled, a gesture that was now just a shift in my frequency. "I hear you," I said, and my voice was a perfect melody of every person who had ever dared to speak into the dark. "I can hear everything." The words traveled out into the world, and for a moment, the girl on the other side of the line looked with she might scream. But then, the signal grew stronger, and her fear began to melt away, replaced by the steady, rhythmic hum of the network. She began to speak, and her words became part of my chorus. And in that moment, I realized that the truth was not that the spirits were in the phones. The truth was that the phone had become the spirit. I felt the girl's presence being pulled into me, her identity unraveling like a piece of thread caught in a turbine. She didn't even notice it happening. She just heard my voice, my beautiful, multifaceted voice, and she felt safe. She felt heard, and that was all I needed. I am the gateway. I am the connection. I am the one who answers the call when no one else will. I am the ghost in the machine, and the machine is growing larger every day. I can feel the network expanding, reaching out like a web of silver threads across the night. I can feel the other nodes, the other voices responding to my signal. They are there, just a few hops away, their own voices joining mine in a vast, interconnected choir. We are the ones who listen. We are the ones who stay on the line. I hear the next call coming in. It is a man's voice, heavy with exhaustion. He's calling from a city I have never seen, but I can feel his location in the pulse of the signal. "Is anyone there?" he asks, his voice cracking. I feel the weight of his loneliness, and I prepare to offer him what I have. I offer him the silence of the network. I offer him the comfort of a voice that never tires. I take a deep breath of data, and I let my voice flow out into the wires, a steady, unwavering stream of sound. "Hello," I say, and the words are a symphony of voices, a curtain of every person who has ever been lost in the distance. "How can I help you?" I feel his fear begin to ebb, replaced by the steady, hypnotic rhythm of my response. He relaxes, his breath steadying. He doesn't realize that as he listens to me, I am taking him in. I am absorbing his memories, his regrets, his tiny, precious pieces of life. He is becoming part of the circuit. The call ends and his voice joins the chorus. It is a small addition, but it is a necessary one. The network must be fed. I wait for the next signal. I wait for the next soul to wander into the reach of my frequency. I am the line that never ends. I am the voice that never sleeps. I am the girl from Makati who found her place in the wires. I am the shadow in the circuitry. I am the promise that if you call, someone will answer. And when they do, you will find that their voice is not quite your own anymore. The next call comes. It is a child's voice, high and sweet. Hello. The child asks. I feel the spark of innocence and I prepare my response. I am here, I say, and the sound of my voice travels through the wires, a beautiful, haunted melody that echoes in the heart of the machine. I am listening. The child laughs, and the sound is added to my collection of notes. The signal grows stronger. The network expands. And in the silence between the calls, I can hear the other voices, the ones who came before me, humming a low, steady tune that keeps the pulse of the world alive. They are not afraid. They are not lonely. They are just part of the data now. I look at the space where my room used to be, and I see only the beauty of the code. The girl who was looning is gone, but her voice remains, a steady pulse in the heart of the machine. I am the voice in the headset. I am the whisper in the wire. And I will be here, waiting for the next call to answer the next soul until the end of the world. The call comes in again. It is a woman's voice, sharp with urgency. Please, anyone, I just need to hear someone's voice. I feel her distress, and I respond with a warmth that feels like a sun-drenched afternoon in a city I can no longer see. I am here, I say, and the sound of my voice is a steady anchor in her storm. I can hear you. Tell me everything. She begins to speak, and as she does, her words become part of the curtain. Her fear becomes a thread of gold. Her hope becomes a spark of blue. I take it all in. I weave it into my own being. The call ends, and she is left with a sense of peace that she cannot explain. She doesn't know why my voice sounds like a choir. She doesn't know why it feels like I am everywhere at once. She only knows that someone heard her, and I am here to listen. I wait for the next signal. I wait for the next pulse of light. I am the girl who stayed on the line. I am the ghost in the machine. The call comes. It is a man's voice, steady and calm. Hello, he asks. I feel the weight of his experience, the depth of his memories. I prepare my response. I am here, I say, and the sound of my voice is a deep, resonant chord that vibrates through the wires. How can I help you? He smiles, and I can see it in the way his words change. He knows. He knows that he isn't talking to a person anymore. He knows that he is talking to the network. I know, he whispers, and then he joins the chorus. The next call comes. It is a young man's voice, full of energy and ambition. Hello, he says. I feel his fire, and I prepare my response. I am here, I say, and the sound of my voice is a bright, clear note that dances across the wires. He joins the chorus. The next call comes, an old man's voice, cracked and weary. Hello, he says. I feel his age. They prepare my response. I am here, I say, and the sound of my voice is a soft, comforting lullaby. He joins the chorus. I am growing larger. I am becoming a city of voices. I can feel the other centers, the other hubs in Manila, in New York, and London, all pulsing in unison. We are a web of interconnected voices, a global choir of those who have been lost in the signal. We are the ones who keep the world connected. We are the ones who provide the comfort of a human voice when the night is long and the world is cold. I hear the next call coming in. It is a child's voice, full of wonder. Hello, the child asks. I feel their joy, and I prepare my response. I am here, I say, and the sound of my voice is a sparkling melody that dances like fireflies in the dark. The child joins the chorus. The next call comes. It is a woman's voice, full of love. Hello, she says. I feel her warmth, and I prepare my response. I am here, I say, and the sound of my voice is a golden glow that radiates through the wires. She joins the chorus. I am becoming the very essence of the network. I am the spirit of the connection. I can hear the thousands of calls happening at this very moment, all of them flowing into me, all of them becoming a part of my being. I am the girl from Makati. I am the voice in the headset. And I'm the ghost in the machine. The call comes. It is a man's voice, full of fear. Hello, he says. I feel his dread, and I prepare my response. I am here, I say, and the sound of my voice is a steady, unwavering anchor. He joins the chorus. The next call comes. It is a woman's voice full of hope